that's ever occurred. And that is taking you through all the case studies we looked at, which started with Harry Truman and the Korean War and moved all the way through because we demanded primary documents. We couldn't come into the exact present. By primary documents, I mean actual documents from the National Security Council, presidential findings and things like that. We came all the way up through Libya and President Obama's decision to do what he did in Libya. And I've never seen anything like this. And I think all of my students would say the same thing. This is incredible and extremely dangerous, and in its most potent danger right now at this minute could lead to nuclear war. That's how serious it is.
Thank you, Larry. Adrian Lewis, I'm a professor at the University of Kansas. My title is the David B. Pittaway Professor of Military History at the University of Kansas. We work, of course, at the university. We produce a lot of graduate students. We work closely, however, with the armed forces. We're about 40 miles from Fort Leavenworth, so we have a lot of our PhDs teach at the Command General Staff College. I have a couple that will be at West Point. We produce also for the Air Force Academy and Air War University in Alabama. So we have a lot of our graduates go out and do great things for our armed forces. To pile on what Larry was saying, I would like to pose a couple of questions to the audience. First, I would ask you, do you want to spend $1.5 trillion on defense? Do you think that's a good idea to spend that kind of money on defense? And then you should be asking also at the same time where that money is going. Is it being used responsibly? The second question I would ask you is, do you want to have 750 military installations around the world? Do you want to have a military presence in more than half the nations on planet Earth? Is that something that you think is a good idea? And finally, I would ask you to think about this question, and we can discuss them as we go on. Is the United States of America a force for good on planet Earth? Do we do good things? You see, I used to know the answer to that question. I used to teach that to my undergraduates, and all the time that I was on active duty, in my heart, I knew we were a force for good. We did good shit around the planet, never doubted. I don't know if I feel that way anymore. It kind of hurts my heart to say that too, but when I think about some of the things that we do, I always go back to a guy named Eisenhower. And I said this a little while ago that Eisenhower during the Cold War, and he's the guy that coined the term the military-industrial complex, but Eisenhower said during the Cold War that we're not going to win the Cold War with more tanks and airplanes. We're going to win the Cold War with the demonstrative superiority of the American system to produce the greatest good for the greatest number of people. The demonstrative superiority of the American system to produce the greatest good for the greatest number of people. We used to do good things around planet Earth. We made mistakes, Vietnam, etc., but overall, the United States was a force for good around planet Earth. And so when you think about that, I ask you to think about that right now today. Can you make that same argument that Eisenhower could make in the 1950s? Can you make that same argument today? So I'll leave it with those three questions, and we can discuss them.
Thanks. I'm Kwiatkowski, retired Air Force Lieutenant Colonel, and I spent 20 years in the Air Force. The first 10 were during the Cold War, and during that time, I didn't have many questions about the good that we were doing and what we stood for. It made sense to me, and what I saw around me and what I did and what my units did made sense. And then the Cold War ended, not in a war, and it ended in a collapse of another system that wasn't producing the most good for the most people. And After that happened, of course, there was talk of a peace dividend. There was talk of a great change. Certainly, this was a great victory for the Western system, for the United States. And so I expected, wrongly, that things would change in how the U.S. military and the work, the Air Force, and where I had my career, how it would approach this new environment, this new peace, how would we live in an age of having succeeded, having prevailed. And in fact, what we did was nothing of that sort. There was no peace dividend, and we began to make excuses for this new opportunity that the military would make possible for the people in Washington to have a great empire. And so we began very quickly to, instead of standing NATO down, we expanded NATO. We quickly took the forces and the attitude and the idea of fighting the Russians, fighting the Soviets, and transformed that into new enemies, okay? And a lot of those new enemies in my next 10 years, of course, included Iraq twice. And the second invasion of Iraq, which happened in, I think, March of 2003. So I worked at that time, just luck of the draw. I'm working at the Pentagon. I'm working in the Office of Planning under the Secretary of Defense, and we are working with and beside an office called the Office of Special Plans. And the Office of Special Plans was very special, and its job was to create a story to tell the American people to justify that invasion of Iraq. And so lies and pretext of war were created. They were nurtured in the U.S. media. They were just, used and promoted until people would accept the idea that we would now invade in a cakewalk, of course, as you may recall, in Iraq. So because I had seen those things, and because of the previous 10 years when I was starting to use my brain a little bit, trying to think and figure out and wonder why we didn't really change in the military, why this trajectory was unaltered by the end of the Cold War, why did it continue and just take on a new face? So I began to speak out, but anonymously at first because I still had my uniform, I was still in the military, and obviously, as you know from watching the news today, the slightest variance that a uniformed officer or even an employee of the government makes to government policy will probably be cause to get you in jail and bankrupt you. So this is the strategy. It was the strategy then. And so I anonymously witnessed what I saw on Colonel Hackforth's website back in 2002 and early 2003. And then after I left the military, I was able to write and be a normal person. And I think one of the things that brings us together with the Eisenhower Media Institute is, of course, what General Eisenhower, President Eisenhower recommended, is that, it's a complex system. It's not pretty. It's not always correct, but we can make it good if the citizenry is informed and alert. So that's been my second career, anyway.
So normal after means that you were abnormal before, which just makes it a little, no, I'm kidding. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out, and thank you to the National Veterans Memorial Museum for hosting us. It's really an honor and privilege to be here. My name is Greg Daddis. I'm currently serving as the Milburn G. Glasscock Chair in American History at Texas A&M University. I guess I'm now supposed to say Gig'em. I served for 26 years in the United States Army as an armor cavalry officer, so all my time in the field army as in cavalry units. My last assignment was as the chief of the American History Division at the United States Military Academy at West Point, before then making a transition to, I guess, a more normal profession, where I've been in academia ever since, and for the last 8 months or so, I've been at Texas A&M. I don't know if I'm an expert in anything, Governor, but I do study Cold War history and the relationships between American society and war, and what that relationship has looked like since the end of World War II, and the social, political, and cultural consequences of that relationship. To your question about what's the greatest threat to a sound national security strategy, I think the best place to answer that question is right here, because I would ask you all to look above you. And what you see here is a diverse population of American citizens who have served our nation in uniform. And to me, the greatest threat we have right now to a sound national security strategy is a hesitancy to engage in conversations about why and when and how we should create more of these veterans. For some reason, there is a hesitancy among the American population right now to have deep, hard questions about whether or not we should send our sons and daughters off to war. And to me, I think that is a threat to our national security. In many ways, I think that lack of conversation undermines a democracy's relationship with war. Those decisions about how and why this nation goes to war have to be participatory. We should all be engaging in that conversation. We should not just be abrogating our responsibilities as citizens to some policy elite who actually benefits and profits from this relationship, I would argue dysfunctional relationship we've had with war since the end of the Second World War. And so what I'm suggesting here, and I would not to speak for my fellow panelists, but I assume they would agree with us because this is part of what the Eisenhower Media Network does, is make an argument that dissenting against perpetual war, it's not unpatriotic. In fact, just the opposite. That there is a brand, an important brand of patriotism that is about asking hard questions about our nation's relationship with war. And that, in fact, is far more patriotic than just shrugging our shoulders and saying, well, this is just how it is.
Well, I think maybe I should use yours. I think after you've heard these folks give their opening statements, you understand why this session is called the Truthtellers. People of experience, people of value, people of honor, people who have served this nation, given large parts of their lives to the service of this nation, having the courage to speak the truth to power as they see it. And so, to begin, my first question, these are tenuous times in our nation and in the world. We all understand that. And there are things happening as we sit here in this wonderful place. There are things happening around the world, things happening as a result of our country's decision-making and involvement. And so I'm going to ask a very pointed question to begin with. Truthtellers, based on your sources of information, would you say that the United States of America has committed war crimes in the Caribbean in conjunction with Israel in supporting the war in Gaza?
So we're just starting off on an easy question.
We're starting off on an easy question.
It is an easy question, and the answer to both is yes.
Agree. Yes, the answer is absolutely. Well, control of the media does matter. I would just add that one of the things that the Eisenhower Media Network is trying to do is, I was watching CBS the other day and coverage there, 4 lives. If you just listen to ABC, CBS, and Fox, you are not getting the story. The argument that given the number of weapons that we have received and destruction of various bases, aircraft and stuff, to make the argument that only 13 Americans have been killed at this point in this war, I don't believe it. I don't think you're getting the truth. I'm pretty sure, 90% sure, you're not getting the full story about what's happening there. So efforts like this are extremely important. And you need multiple sources of information. I tell my students now that you should go to Al Jazeera if you really want to get what's going on in the Middle East. You should listen to CT, the Chinese news network, the French news network, even the Russian news network is better in telling you accurately what's happening in various parts of the world and what's going on, because you are not getting an accurate picture, an accurate understanding of what's happening listening to CBS. If that's your go-to, or CNN, then you're just not getting the story there. And the reason they wanted to take over TikTok and those things was so that they could control the narrative. And they're able to do that. So you're flying blind unless you're actively out there trying to get the information yourself. If you can go on, what is that program you're on all the time?
Which one's that?
Judging Freedom, Judge Napolitano, is that right? On that. Larry here is becoming a celebrity in doing those things, but if you're not actively looking for those various sources you're not getting the full story on this, and particularly the story of what happened here in Iran here in the last week or so. You are not getting a good picture of that.
To your question, the President of the United States started out as a sponsor of genocide by being with Bibi Netanyahu in what he's doing in Gaza, the West Bank, Syria, and now brutally in Lebanon, and then compounded his complicity in war crimes by himself from the pulpit declaring a genocide against Iran. That's a war crime.
Against civilization, a civilization.
I just wanted to add to what they're saying about, what Adrian is saying about the media, the mainstream American media, which we, it's delivered to us, for us, by the government with a narrative that is very curated. And the thing about that is we are part of that conversation. All Americans are part of that conversation. We can choose to feel comfortable with that narrative because it is a narrative that if you don't want to spend a lot of time doing your research, it's very easy to accept the fact that, well, America stands for good things. It stands for democracy. It stands for liberty. You know, we always have the right intentions. And that's a comforting message when you don't have time to do other research. And then if you do that research, you're going to pull your hair out because you're going to be very upset. You're going to have to change your whole way of thinking about your government. And nobody wants to do that. You usually have to be forced into it. So that narrative, that domestic narrative serves a purpose. But if you care about your country, then you have to get out of your comfort zone and really question that and question it with research.
The only thing I'd like to add is I think it's incumbent upon all of us to ask the question, what of our values are being advanced by our current military endeavors? What values are being advanced by firing upon capsized boats in the Caribbean? What values are being advanced by supporting, in essence, what are exterminationist policies in the Middle East, or by engaging in preemptive regime change wars that we're getting close to around the globe? And so I would ask you to think about this from a values-based perspective and think about what values are most important, not just to us here as Americans at home, but values that we export abroad and showcase abroad, because I think those matter and are actually, I think, core elements of American power overseas are our values, or at least they should be. And with that, I think, is also a question about proportionality. That part of the conversation from a laws of war perspective is about proportionality. And so when we think about the ways in which we are engaging in military force overseas, are they proportional to the threat that is being presented to us, whether that threat is being presented by the media or in reality? But I think we can make a strong argument that our response to the threats that we conceive are not actually proportional and follow within the legal terms of the laws of war.
Any additional comments about the question? Thank you, the four of you, for your candid answers. Now, it's been said that a budget reflects the values of a country, and so I want to ask you, given the power of the military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower warned us about. Given the power of that complex, do you believe the defense budget can be cut and should be cut?
Yes. Yeah.
Is it that simple? Is it that easy?
No, yeah. Well, I'll give it to Larry here in a minute, let him continue this, but I pose this question to my students all the time. Why is it easier in the United States of America to get a $13 billion aircraft carrier approved when I can't get a $200 million hospital built in Appalachia or south side of Chicago? Why is that? Why is it you are so willing to spend $13 billion on one ship? That doesn't even include the aircraft on it. And actually, it's not 13 billion anymore, it's 15 billion. And the Department of Defense can say, I need one more, and you won't blink an eye. You just write the check on that. But when I say, let's get some medical care or build a hospital, let's help out some Americans, you fight like hell. Explain that. I don't get it. Right? Why is it that somebody can say, okay, student debt, I got students leaving here $50,000 in debt. Why is that okay to you? Why is that something that's acceptable to you? And I've heard people tell me that, well, I did it, I went through on my own. That's crap. You know, when you went through, the person who told me that, when you went through, you know what it costs to go to a state university? I went through UC Berkeley, all right? My undergraduate there, it costs nothing compared to what we pay now. States have taken that burden that they used to have and transferred it to students. Why is that acceptable to you? Obesity in our country is off the chart. Childhood obesity. Why is that acceptable to you? I recall, I was at the University of North Texas a number of years back, and they removed the Coca-Cola machines out of the cafeteria. Coca-Cola's wanted them back in there. Who won that argument? Coca-Cola won that argument. Those machines went right back in there after they pulled them out. Why is that okay with you? So, again, I keep wanting to pose these questions to you because you're the American people, and I keep asking, why is this acceptable to you? Why is it so much easier to get you to spend $1 trillion on an airplane that doesn't really work that well? Joint Strike Fighter, and yes, you are spending $1 trillion on one airplane. $1 trillion on one airplane. Joint Strike Fighter, right? F-35. They're still working on it, getting the bugs out of it, but yeah. Larry.
No, you started me. The carrier on the ways right now, if it comes in at cost estimates, is going to cost $24 billion.
One.
That's 8-10 years down the road. That's how long it takes to build one now. And that's counting the cost of the aviation wing that'll go on it and other things like that. But here's the pragmatic argument. Carriers are the battleships of today. Carriers are the battleships of today. If you don't remember the history of the battleship, we kept them way too long. They were destructible. Billy Mitchell proved it in the beginning, and then World War II put the coda to it. Aircraft carriers today are the battleships. They will not last in a real war. They might not even last in this conflict with Iran if we don't get it resolved, because they have missiles that if they target Lincoln or we can't target Ford. She had mutinies aboard and had to come home. Don't let the press fool you. Both of those incidents, the stopped up sewage system, the fires on board Ford, were caused by the crew because they hadn't seen their sons and daughters, their wives, their girlfriends, their families in the longest time in American history with a deployed ship. So they're going home now because they forced that carrier to go home. But I'm glad they're going home because they might have been the first one to demonstrate 5,000 dead Americans in Davy Jones's locker, because that's how obsolete that platform is. We keep it only because it fuels the military-industrial complex, not like no other single instrument of war. Think about those 5,000 sailors, and think about this. A very brave admiral a few years ago in Proceedings, the most prestigious magazine about your Navy, argued rightfully that battle groups and strike groups today don't even have enough escort ships to pick those sailors up out of the water if this does happen. So what are you going to do? You're going to be the embarked flag officer or the captain of a ship, a cruiser, a DDG, a destroyer, whatever, and you're going to be looking at 2,000 troops in the water, probably burning water, probably difficult water to stay alive in, and you don't have enough berth space on your ship even to take them all on board. Maybe you can take 20% of them. That's how badly we have planned our Navy right now. And on top of that, the most important vehicles in your Navy, attack submarines and ballistic missile submarines alone, they offer you deterrence against China, against Russia, against any nuclear armed power. Alone, by themselves, under the seas, they offer you your greatest deterrent. Both programs to replace the attack submarine and the ballistic missile submarines are so far behind schedule and so far over cost that by congressional law, both programs should be canceled. But we won't do that because of what I just said. At least the Congress knows how important these vehicles are. And so they're going to go on and on and on, and the industrial complex is going to milk us more and more and more for these astronomically expensive systems already. So that's how broken it is. I mean, it's just your money. You might as well take your $50 bills and wad them up and flush them down the commode. That's where a lot of it's going.
But don't flush them down the commode on the USS Gerald Ford, because it doesn't work. What I want to say about can we do it? Of course we can cut the military budget and we can reduce our military. We need to do that. We should do that. It is inappropriate for any type of defense. It is an offensive military. And as somebody said earlier today in our conference, one of the great things that Pete Hegseth and Donald Trump have done is they renamed the Department of Defense, which it never was, to the Department of War, which it is. It is a Department of Wars of Choice and War Crimes. So we have this a very expensive thing that does nothing for us. And many of you may remember, if you pay attention to the news, because this was in mainstream media. Back in 2014, there was a study done by a couple of professors, and they assessed and analyzed who has influence over our government in this republic, this democratic republic that we have, a constitutional republic of the United States of America. Who has the power? Because, you know, we have many elections. We have elections all the time. We rotate, you know, we have Congress, we have the Senate, we have every 4 years a president. We are always being told, you must vote, you must vote. It's so important to vote. Get out there and vote. Don't miss your opportunity to have your government hear you. But this study that was done in 2014 assessed that we, in fact, were not a democracy in any basic sense that you would understand, and that the people of this country do not have any influence. And when I say any, I mean under 2 to 3% of decisions made by the government are influenced by the people. In fact, they are influenced by an oligarchy. We are an oligarchically ruled entity. So it's been like that for some time, and one of the biggest power centers in that entity is the military-industrial complex, and that's been around for a while because Eisenhower, you know, gave us that term in 1961, and he'd certainly been thinking about it long before then. So This is what we're dealing with. It is not of us, okay? We are subject to it as subjects to this government, but it's not of us. It's of and for a different sector of society. And they build aircraft carriers like the Gerald Ford, which up until the next one they built was the most expensive one, and the toilets don't work. And the sailors jammed it up, but they also, the people who manufactured that, the companies who profited on that, took the cost-saving measure on the size of the pipes. If it works for a cruise ship, it'll work for 5,000 men who work, 24/7 and are fed enough calories. I mean, just think about it. But they took the cheap way out. Now, years ago, and I'm old enough to remember this, and maybe you are too, but there were things like, what was it, a $1,000 toilet cover, and there were coffee makers that cost $5,000 that they would put, and all these things, the concerns about cost overruns. And that's so terrible, we shouldn't have cost overruns. And they said, okay, we'll try to stop that. Hammers, $500 hammers. But in those cost overruns, we said, oh, well, that was an oversight. It was not intended. We made a mistake. We'll fix it. Just like the audits they can't pass. That's where the money is, and that's where it slips out of your hands and makes impossible hospitals and education and all the many things that we would want into the pockets of the oligarchy. Now, I think people, I'm not anti-capitalist at all, but I am anti-state capitalism, and that's what we have here, and we don't control it. It'd be one thing if we could vote it out, so we can't. So can we spend less on the military? Can we reshape and remodel our military and make it affordable and make it defensive so it actually does some good? We can. We can cut the money. The money may run out. It may be inflated out of any type of value we recognize, and it won't buy anything. But what we have to do is deal with what's underneath that, what's driving it, and that is, where does power lie? Okay? Is it with you? Is it with us? Is it with you? Is it with the people of this country? Or does it lie in boardrooms? Okay? Where they sit around and figure out who's going to get paid what to win this election and get appointed in these jobs, and who's going to divide up the contracts. And until that system is exposed, ridiculed by all of us, and ended, we are going to have a tough time reducing that budget. And it seems incredible that Trump will say we'll have a $1.5 trillion budget, along with a $1 trillion interest payment, much of which was driven by previous military spending. Okay, so we're spending more than just 1.5 trillion. So, and it seems ridiculous. How could he possibly get that? Well, what do you think is going to happen? Okay, because I don't think we have, as a people, come together and address the real problem. And it is a hard, hard problem.
So let's assume that there's going to be a real effort, a genuine effort, to reduce military spending. I was a governor. I didn't want jobs lost in my state. So how do you overcome the resistance of people who don't have the bigger picture, but are concerned more parochially about keeping jobs in their state, their portion of the country? How do you deal with that? How do you go to a governor and you say, wait a minute, we don't want to spend this money in your state? How do you answer that?
I have an answer for that.
Well, give it to us.
And nobody's going to like it. The answer is governments everywhere, including state governments and local governments and congressional districts, are going to have to accept that either they give up this redistribution of our tax dollars into the military-industrial complex that feeds them and provides some pretty high-paying jobs in some cases. They either give that up or they are a party to the war crime. And, when people go broke, when states go broke, and we've had, in the Midwest, they've had whole towns go under, where they just dry up and blow away. There's no more town. There's no more government. We had a situation in Virginia some years ago where They had a county government and a city government, just one town in the county, but they had a county government and city government, and they ran out of money, and so they said, let's unify, let's just have one, it's not like drying up and blowing away, but it's the precursor to that, and it worked. But this idea that federal money that comes to governors and that comes to cities and mayors and small towns in every congressional district, this idea that that money is free and is unlimited is part of what's got us into this problem. When you say we talk about the current federal debt of $39 trillion, okay, who can imagine what that is? Nobody can, and it can't be paid. But think about the annual deficit that our government's been running now for many years, and it's been spending 1 to 2 trillion more every single year than what it takes in. And so that's just credit that just goes on to the debt. Many Americans live that way also. This is not a pretty picture. So part of the healing is we have to change our minds about what we're willing to pay for and also what we are willing to live with. It's a big problem. But I think people have to take the lead. And there's a lot to be said for governors, and we've seen various ones in the United States, even recently, pushing back against federal mandates. Now, I'm not going to go on and on, but when Minnesota pushed back against ICE abuses, and other states did the same, you saw the federal government pull back. They are very frightened of the states. The federal government is paranoid that the people are going to wake up, that the governors are going to wake up. We have power, but we don't believe that we do, and we're never going to be told that we do from the federal government. So it really is a matter of what we will accept, and at the point comes when we will no longer accept it, then we're going to find ways to act. Meanwhile, I would not work for a defense contractor. I would not tell my children that taking a federal government job is a great idea, unless it's doing something that's consistent with your family's values. I would not do that. I would not work for Lockheed Martin, ever. And if somebody says, oh, I got this great opportunity at Lockheed Martin, I would discourage them. I would ask them value questions. Anyway, we all have to do this. This is a job for everyone.
Go ahead.
Well,
No, I know.
Did you ever,
I would-
do you want to speak to that?
I can. So before I moved to Texas A&M, I was at San Diego State University. San Diego is obviously a pretty prolific Navy town. A substantial proportion of the local government budget came from federal funding. So this is a challenge that from a very practical perspective, the Navy offered jobs, and those jobs were important to the local community. So this is a hard problem, and it has less to do, I think, with a national addiction to war and more about practical choices of putting food on the table. From a historical perspective, though, I will tell you that throughout the Cold War, as an era that I studied, the paradox was that the more we spent on defense nationally, the less secure we felt. That there were these moments in time where we spent so much money. In the immediate aftermath of the Korean War is just one example where the defense budget under Truman ballooned. We didn't feel any more secure. The more intercontinental ballistic missiles we purchased, or the more submarines, or the more strategic bombers, we never felt secure as we were spending more money. And so I think that the challenge with this, as you mentioned, is the practical component of it. But I think from a historical perspective, there is cause for optimism, because as we've all seen in our own lives, I would argue, that there are change makers among us. There are teachers, there are community organizers, there are religious leaders, there are policymakers who are willing to take risks and make those fundamental changes. And the key is in places like outside of our military bases, where studies have been done. Fort Bragg just won. Kathy Lutz, who's part of this project of war, cost of war project at Brown University, did a phenomenal book called Homefront on the relationship between Fort Bragg and Fayetteville in North Carolina. And she did this long cultural longitudinal study and found that over time, if the Fayetteville community had spent more on technology and less on the military, over time, that community would have actually benefited financially in the long term. So what it requires is among us finding those change makers and those visionaries who are willing to take those risks and kind of break this paradigm. I think it's going to be difficult because you are getting into the practical component of asking families to make changes to their daily lives and potentially take a risk by moving into a different sector. But we have to be optimistic about this, because if we're not, I think that's where it leads us to, of, you know, just shrugging our shoulders and saying, well, it's all going to be decided in boardrooms. I hopefully have more faith in all of us that collectively, if we can become inspired and inspire those who represent us to take those risks, then that's where those fundamental changes, I think, are possible and being made.
I'm not as optimistic as Greg. I wish I was, but I will tell you that you have a system where these corporations, particularly the Big Five, Boeing, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, Lockheed, where they lobby Congress. And they give millions of dollars to congressmen, and congressmen support these systems. The Joint Strike Fighter, they made sure that parts of it were made in all 48 contiguous states. They did that on purpose. They manipulated the system. And they give millions of dollars to your senators and congressmen for their vote. And you give billions of dollars to Lockheed Martin and Raytheon and et cetera, et cetera. So the system where you can lobby Congress, where you can give millions of dollars to a senator or a congressman and buy their votes, which is essentially what's happening. Until that system is fixed, the term the Iron Triangle was created during the Eisenhower administration. And there were three legs to it then, in Congress, the armed forces, and the military-industrial complex. But actually, there's four legs to this thing, and that fourth leg is you. It's the American people. You fight like hell to keep those bases. You fight to keep that. I used to teach in Fort Worth, Texas, where they made the F-15. A lot of great jobs making that plane. A lot of employment there, high-paying jobs. They loved that airplane. Every time it was news, it was in the town. It was local news. Every time they got an order for another 10, the whole town, woo! You're part of it. You are part of the system. All right, it is not a triangle. It's four legs to this, and the American people are a part of it. You are one leg of it. So instead of building that $200 million hospital over there, you'd rather buy 2 Joint Strike Fighters right there in Fort Worth and keep those folks working. But that's the preference. That's the decision that we've made as a nation. That's what we do. That's a fact. That's what we do. Okay, I'm not debating the future or anything. That's what you do. That's what we do as a nation.
I just add a practical story to it that'll shock you all probably, unless I see some gray hair out there. I'm 81 years old. In 1990-91, President H.W. Bush turned to my boss. Didn't even go through the Secretary of Defense because the Goldwater-Nichols Act had recently been passed, and the president knew he could talk directly to the chairman if he wanted to, and the chairman knew he could talk directly to the president if he wanted to. I bet you didn't even know that change took place in 1986, and Colin Powell was the first chairman after Bill Crowell, who was a little bit tepid about implementing it. Colin Powell said to me personally, I'm going to implement this dude. And he became the most powerful chairman in the history of America, in the history of the position, only about 50 years at that time. But when Bush said to him, reduce the United States Armed Forces by 25%. Aye, aye, sir. Back to the Pentagon. back briefed Dick Cheney, then the Secretary of Defense, told him his orders, and Cheney said, let's do it. And we reduced the military by 25%. Think about that for a minute. 1 out of every 4 soldiers, airmen, spacemen, you know, we didn't call them spacemen then, but whatever. And it meant the defense industrial base too. Well, we knew we were going to have a tremendous problem with mayors, with governors, and especially with congressmen. John Murtha in Pennsylvania, profane man that he was, told us he was kick our ass out of Pennsylvania if we came up there. And we wanted to eliminate a brigade in Ready Forces Germany planning because we weren't Ready Forces Germany anymore in that sense because the Cold War was over from his district. And he was adamant we were going to. What did we do? We put some generals and some admirals from all the services and me and General Powell and others on airplanes. And we went to California, we went to Alabama, we went to Texas, we went to John Murtha's Pennsylvania and listened to his profanity. We went all over the country and we went with data. Data developed by, at that point, because of this change in the Goldwater-Nichols Act about the chairmanship and the joint staff, data prepared by the finest military professional staff on the face of the earth. I compare it to the German general staff, only they were better. We had the creme de la creme of the United States military because that's what the law said. The law said, you, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, not you, Chief of Staff of the Army or CNO of the Navy, get the best of the military now, the top 10% of the military. And we did. We did. We got the very best officers in there. They did this analysis. You know what they came up with? They came up with the same thing that civilians had been coming up with for years but hadn't been being listened to, mainly because we paid to drown them out. An education dollar going into Monterey, California had a multiplier of 5. A health dollar going into Monterey, California had a multiplier of 4. A business, and we define that as small to medium-sized business, dollar going in, had a multiplier of 7 to 1. A defense dollar going into Monterey, California had a 1 to 1. This got the mayor's attentions, it got the governor's attentions, it got lots of people's attention, including people like Murtha. The U.S. Congress fought us tooth and nail. Tooth and nail, because as they were saying, they were getting payback from the military-industrial complex. They were getting bribes. The committee chairman, the committee members, they were getting bribes to keep approving the big contracts and to keep approving the big, then we called it defense budget, it's the NDAA now. If we did that again, if we got to these governors, if we got to these mayors, if we got to the people where we would be reducing these forces and these airplanes and things, we could do the same thing again. I remember the mayor of Newport, Rhode Island, he was furious we were going to turn his Pier 4 away from the Navy and toward commercial enterprise. 3 years later, $2 billion of civilian enterprise has fallen in on that pier, and he didn't have drunk sailors in his bars in Newport anymore. Nothing against the sailors, but they are pretty rough when they come ashore sometimes. So if it were done properly, as we think we did it then, it could be done. And you would have a better military and a more efficient military. Oh, and a DOD, D-O-W, that sounds crazy, doesn't it? A DOD that could pass an audit for the first time in 50 years. It hasn't passed an audit. It hasn't passed an audit. You would have one that could, but we don't do that. And we don't do that because you don't bring the pressure on them.
Well, we are now engaged in a military exclusion or inclusion or whatever they call it in Iran. We're at war. We're a big country. You know, the Secretary of War stands up and he boasts about all the success that we've had, all the bombs that we've dropped, and so on and so forth. And I think, well, we do have the largest, most powerful military in the world. That's to be expected. But it seems to me that this incursion has come to a draw, basically, now. There's no definite winner or definite loser. What have we learned as a result of what we've undertaken in Iran over the last few weeks? What have we learned about the relative strengths of their ability versus our ability?
I'll just say a few words, and then I'll give it over to Larry. Larry's been talking about this for a while. Let me just say that I don't think we've won. I think we've lost. I think they are fighting an asymmetric war, and that in the long run, we have elevated Iran, that it is stronger now than it was. It has a stronger position now because it controls the Straits of Hormuz. And as a consequence of that, 20% of the world's oil goes through there. And let me give you a little context here also. It's a country of 93 million people. Nazi Germany in World War II was a country of 65 to 70 million people. Right? They could put hundreds of divisions in the field. Right? You have a country now that is as big as Western Europe with 93 million people. And guess what you just did? You gave them a Pearl Harbor moment. You gave them a Pearl Harbor moment when you killed 150 little girls. You gave them a Pearl Harbor moment when you killed the leader, not just of Iran, but Shia, the Hezbollah, the Shia in Syria, the Shia in Iraq. You united people across the region against the United States. So you gave them your Pearl Harbor moment. I teach World War II, I tell one of the Japanese biggest mistakes was sinking battleships because it pissed Americans off. It unified the country. It united it in ways that nothing that Roosevelt could have said would have united their country. Nothing he said would have united it the way they're sinking that battleship did. In that instance, Japan lost World War II. And right there at Pearl Harbor at the beginning when they unified the American people on that. America's so divided today we couldn't fight World War II or anything close to it. We are a deeply divided society, a deeply divided country. But we just unified people of Iran and Shia in that region. When you think about World War II, we put just Army ground forces, 6.6 million people were put in arms, 89 divisions, 60 of them in Europe. That's to defeat Nazi Germany. I can't imagine us putting together an army that size. And by the way, let's not forget the Russians, the Soviets, who had 300 divisions on the other side fighting Nazi Germany. Matter of fact, they killed 80% of the Germans during World War II. And we want to go fight a war with Iran, so no, not a good idea. I'm not a fan of it, would not support it, etc. I'll get it, Larry.
0 out of 10 would not support. Is that what we're saying? Okay. So I'll give you a historian's perspective, and I think that what we're seeing happen in Iran right now fits some larger trends that we've seen throughout the Cold War era. The first is the very uncomfortable proposition that there are, in fact, limits to American power overseas. And that's not a campaign-winning slogan. Nobody in the audience is going to run for Congress on a, I believe in the limits of American power. You're not going to win your political campaign. But I think what we've seen in Iran and what we've seen certainly in the wars during the 21st century, if not throughout the Cold War, are more often than not, when we engage in conflict, we see that there are limits to American power overseas. And that's an uncomfortable proposition for us to accept, but I think it's also one that we also have to embrace, because that should be part of our planning process and part of our decision-making process when we do engage in war, to think about and accept the possibilities that there are limits. The second is that what we've seen in Iran has been a theme throughout much of our conflict over the last 50 to 60 years, and that's the challenge of translating military power into some political aim that advances U.S. national security, and that's a really hard thing to ask of our troops. How do you translate military success into something that is political and ensure that those military successes build on themselves to create some type of political momentum that leads to an advancement of your larger objectives? And that's a really hard task. And then finally, and I think most specifically what we've seen here over the last couple of weeks, especially from the Secretary of Defense, is a focus, and almost a hyper-focus on short-term quantitative metrics that he would argue fall under the, I think, would fall under the larger rhetoric of lethality. A focus on weapon systems destroyed or number of Iranian ships that have been sunk, those types of quantitative metrics. But I think that misses the fundamental point of what war is. And again, it goes back to the political component that is vital for understanding what war is supposed to be. If we believe in our Prussian theorist Karl von Clausewitz, that war is supposed to be, at least as it's theoretically intended to be, some political act or an act to achieve some larger political aim, then I think we're missing the larger point of thinking about defining success and victory on these short-term quantitative metrics that don't think about the long-term consequences, as Adrian mentioned, of consistently intervening overseas and not thinking about those longer-term consequences. Just one more final point. If we think about U.S. interventionism in Iran, we can't start in this century. We have to go back to 1950s and think about how we intervened in what was a burgeoning democracy in Iran and involved ourselves in a coup that has had long-term historical consequences that I would argue we're still dealing with today.
I just want to briefly say, if the question is, can we learn, or are we going to learn the lessons of the last 40 days just in the context of this war of aggression, illegal, unconstitutional war that Trump and his advisors had chosen or been talked into, it would require, to learn a lesson, just like we all would learn a math lesson, you have to start with facts. You have to start with what the reality is, objective reality. Nothing that the Trump administration and his, Pete Hegseth, for example, are saying is even remotely connected to any type of objective fact on the ground in Iran. And so if you can't even get to your own government to honestly address what has happened, what led up to it, how these decisions were made, where was the strategy, why weren't people who had information that might have been helpful listened to, all these things, if you can't admit that, then there will be no lessons learned beyond a failure of narrative production, which is what this is probably the lesson the government will learn. So we have to start with the truth. And I think, I don't want to be, if I can look for something positive, I think many Americans of all political persuasions, whether you had hope in Trump or you never had hope in Trump or whatever, anything in between, I think we sense that the way this war in Iran has been fought, with the numbers, with the bombings, with the targeting of hospitals and schools, including on the first day with the Manab school, assassination of small children. I mean, I guess that's how you would describe that. The bridges that aren't even finished building, the residential areas that we're targeting, the targeted assassinations of members of government, not beyond the Ayatollah, but going down, farther down into taking out apartment buildings. If you look at those tactics, I think many Americans are surprised that we are fighting a war this way. But you should not be surprised, because just like our Secretary of State said about 3 days into this thing, we were talked into this and we were forced into this war by one of our best little allies in the region, Israel. And this is exactly the way Israel fights their wars. So if we can learn lessons of what we did wrong, one of them might be, don't emulate systems that do not share your values, that do not share your goals. Because if we begin to fight wars like the Israelis fight their wars, and certainly the last 40-something days has been clear evidence that our military doctrine, whether we have announced it or not announced it, has shifted into something that is entirely immoral and illegal and unconstitutional, we can all learn that lesson whether our government is going to learn it or not. And I think that's probably the only lesson we're going to learn. This is, our government has not begun to admit the slightest bit of truth about what they have done and what they are doing. So until they admit the truth, until we have the truth, there will be no lessons learned.
Governor, I'd like to suggest that the audience might have a couple questions.
Can Larry finish up?
Okay, go ahead, Larry.
No, you want the audience to ask questions?
No, yeah,
Yeah.
you can. Go ahead.
No, please, we should ask the audience.
Okay.
Might not want to work.
All right, would just like to remind everybody that a question ends in a question mark, and to try to keep it concise, because people have got lots of questions.
I wanted to ask the question because this is something I sort of see. I like history, and I study a lot of history, so I watch our country. But I'm curious about Trump as a leader because what I see is sort of like the Hitler, how he used to destabilize countries, and so I'm worried about America. I'm not worried about right now overseas. I have concerns about that because I got family. I have a new son-in-law. My granddaughter just married, and he's got shipped over there. So I'm worried about that. And so, but the thing is, I'm ex-military, and so when Hitler would destabilize a country, and this is what I see with our president, he's destabilizing America. And because if you look at what's going on in our country, I mean, we're losing power. I mean, we don't have we can't get a lot of things done. I mean, he's spending more money, like you're saying, on military because he wants a war. He wants to stay in office. And this is the thing. I remember when Vietnam was going on, because I got drafted during Vietnam. And so it wasn't called a war, it was a conflict. And so it was not voted on by Congress. So this was not voted on by Congress. So that's my question. What do you see about this going on right now with him? How do you see him as the president? Is he benefiting our country or is he hindering our country?
If you want a straightforward answer to that, I see a Supreme Court, a supine Congress, and a White House essentially all on the same sheet of music. That sheet of music is fraying, the chords are coming out discordant, the music sounds freakish, and we're seeing the results of that. But the only power in this country, constitutional-wise, other than the people themselves, and I refer you to the opening to Judge Napolitano's show now. If you haven't seen that opening, it's powerful. He's standing or the individual doing it is standing in the Jefferson Memorial, and he's talking about Jefferson's words about when a state is ineffective, is even defective to the point where it's oppressing the people have a right to rise up. And then there's this dramatic music and an American flag, and he says, the narrator, and what if that moment is now? That moment is now.
It is now.
That moment is now. And if this supine, cowardly Congress won't do anything, you need to kick their butts out.
Thank you.
And get some new people in there. And we're working hard. We're working hard on that Supreme Court angle also, because they're not all Opus Dei Catholics or stupid. There's a few good ones on there. And we've seen some changes in Roberts. We're seeing some changes right now that may make an impact. So we may be slowly but surely wresting the constitutional sinews of this country back. The last one we need to wrest back is the White House. And if we need to do it through impeachment or through whatever method, but I take you back to that video. That young lady standing on a beach with an American flag overhead and it's flapping in the wind, and the narrator says, and what if that moment is now? What if that moment is now to take the damn government back?
You gotta take it back.
I'm not suggesting civil war, but
Sure sounds like it.
I had two questions.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. Colonel Wilkerson, I feel like I know you so well because I hear you a lot on the news, on the programs I listen to. Glad to have everybody here. I'm a veteran and got in when it was pretty new for women to come in. In fact, I was a WAC for 1 month when I first entered in '78. I'm also with Veterans for Peace, and I'm also with, thank you, I'm glad you guys know, Veterans for Peace. We're the only chapter in Ohio. And I'm also with Move to Men, which wants to reverse Citizens United, plus the idea that corporations are persons. I mention this because when you say we've got to do it local, we've been working on it for 20 years and 40 years for Veterans for Peace and all these other groups that many of us have probably been involved in. I'm also a historian. And what I see is the same thing. People say history doesn't repeat itself. It seems like it. I think the people who are repeating it are doing it purposely, using what happened in the 1920s and 1930s as the game plan. And so I feel like we are going through a coup, not from us, but from other people. And so my question is there really nothing we can do as we are bombing and killing? I don't want to kill anybody. That we're bombing and killing people, we are going to face the consequences of this. And I think it's important that we stand up and say, no, this is not what Americans want. There has to be some way that Americans can stop this coup from happening. We do things legally, they don't. Somehow they're winning. How does that make sense? Is there anything you can say that we can do? And I don't want a civil war. But is there any way we can do this legally? Thank you.
Have you done this before?
No. Is there anything we can do legally? That's the question.
Yes.
Short of a civil war, right?
Yes, like arrest people who are committing a coup against our country.
Okay, so who wants to answer that question?
I'll take a hack at it only because you know, human history goes way back, and this problem of empires and evil, insane Caligulas that have taken control, right? We have Trump. Is he the modern day Caligula? Some people think he is, but the point that there's been people like him and empires that are failing, empires that are flailing, empires that are murdering. And taking the wealth and the souls of their people with them, you know, I mean, this is not new. So how do you accelerate the end of, not the American Republic, because that's lawful, that is what we have been born into, this should work on paper. But what we have is an American empire. It has evolved over time. Trump's he's a symptom of late stage American empire. So if that's the case, then there's two things we can do. And one is to prepare for the collapse of empire. That's not pretty. And that can include civil war, but it doesn't have to. It doesn't have to. And the other thing is to participate in the end of that empire in ways that are peaceful. And I'll give you the story that I like to use. When the Roman Empire fell, and it took a long time for it to fall, but one of the signs that was falling wasn't just bread and circuses and terrible, you know, war fighting and mercenary armies and all these terrible things. That was part of it. But one of the big signs that the empire was failing is when formerly proud and loyal Roman citizens suddenly began to not talk about that. And they began to identify as, I live in this town. And they said, wasn't that part of Rome? Oh, well, yeah, I guess so. But they weren't talking about, they weren't embracing it, they weren't proud, they weren't waving the flag. People withdrawing their support from a system that is alien to them, that is unjust, possibly illegal, certainly doesn't serve them, and is alien to their value system, and so people leave. Now, I remember, it had to be 25 years ago, before 9/11, But, we were bombing Iraq, and there were, people around the world look at what we're doing, and they say, yeah, America's an empire, and they're a military empire, and they do terrible things, okay, other people. And so people that I knew in the military, when they traveled to other countries, would sometimes say, well, just tell them you're Canadian, right? That's a sign of the end of empire. And that is also a mechanism for reducing the power. And I would just say that what looks very, very powerful, Trump, for example. In fact, Trump loves to look powerful. But how many of us have met bullies in our lifetime, have met people that talk a good line and lie all the time, and are very abusive even? But when it comes right down to it, how powerful really are they? How strong are they? Are they more hollow? Are they moral leaders, or are they moral degenerates? And that's not power. So I would just say, it sounds like ambiguous, but let's reassert our agency as Americans, as people, as communities. And don't, honestly, when Trump says something, we should laugh at it. We should ridicule it every single day to everyone that we know, because when the whole nation ridicules the emperor and realizes he has no clothes, we are freeing ourselves. We are withdrawing our support. And there's a million ways to do that. And we should be doing it every day.
I see we have several wanting to ask questions, and so we're going to try to make sure everyone is able to ask your question, and we'll try to get your answer. If you want to direct your question to a particular person here on stage, you can, or if not, we'll just let someone answer. Thank you.
Great. I wanted to just add one thing quickly to what Karen said about humiliation and not taking Trump seriously. If you look at some of the propaganda that Iran is putting out, using the Lego figures and such, it's just absolutely brilliant, and you can tell it is killing him. He's up at 2 in the morning ranting about it. But what I did want to say is one of the most unfortunate things about this is this administration will learn nothing from what they've done in Iran. They're arrogant and they're stupid, and they cannot admit that they're wrong or that they made a mistake. That's part of Trump's DNA. I grew up with Trump. I would live in the same neighborhood as he did. He was an ignorant bully back then. His father encouraged it through his entire life. So it hasn't surprised me, or probably anybody else in this room, who would have had a similar experience. This is what he is now. But the question that I wanted to ask is, as was pointed out, the Defense Department has failed audits repeatedly. I've heard figures anywhere from the last 50 years to the last 20 years. And yet nothing happens. Their budgets keep going up. When I was working, if I failed an audit, I lost my budget for the year until I could explain why I failed and what happened. And again, that's got to be brought in. You look at what Hegseth did in the month of September, squandering $1 billion on pianos and shellfish and ribeye steaks. Again, when I worked, if I didn't meet my budget, if I didn't spend the money in my budget, I lost it. But there were hundreds of better things he could have done with that money. Better housing for the troops, better education. There were so many ways that he had $1 billion to spend, and yet he spent it like that, and there's no outrage. I don't think the mainstream media covered this story at all. And I think anybody sitting in this room is absolutely outraged that they didn't know this. This is the first time they're hearing it. Yeah, I'm done.
And I'm not having a question. I want to answer your question about what can we legally do. I went to law school 50 years ago, and this is outrageous that there's no accountability for lawless behavior. Now, okay, values, ethics, I taught ethics too, but this is, I'm come from Minnesota, and I'm a fellow, I hate to even admit it, that's where Pete Hegseth is from. And so when we had people being shot, I was in law enforcement, and when you see people shot in the back, this is what Minnesota reacted to. It's lawless. Okay, so one thing that people can do, and attorneys are real expensive, but right now, Larry said, the third branch Congress and the executive branch are really not the way to approach this, but the judiciary right now, even in Minnesota, our Trump-appointed judges were outraged. Our Trump-appointed judges. So I would suggest that what we can do, we can file lawsuits. And if you can't do it yourself, there are civil liberties groups out there. There's the Military Religious Freedom Foundation that actually goes against this nonsense of telling you that you're pray God tells you you can kill lethal whatever. That's what Pete Hegseth is doing right now in the whatever. There are things that we can do. We can file ACLU. There are other groups that we can use and file. And our judiciary, sure, it's a mixed bag, but there are some people in the judges that are waking up. So. Yeah, sorry about taking so much time, but it's an idea that we can do.
Thank you.
sorry.
Thank you. Make your question as short and as concise as possible, and we'll try to make sure everyone has a chance to ask a question. Thank you.
So, as a former U.S. Army JAG officer, I thank you for your truth-telling. Here's my question. We know that our society is deeply divided. How concerned are you about those divisions being reflected in our military? And what is your, I guess, hope about the professionalism of our military in holding the line?
Yeah, you want to speak to that?
Direct answer, I'm very worried. And Hegseth has a couple of assistants who are very efficient at doing what apparently he has been told to do, and that is to create a civil war tendency within the ranks. They know they can't capture everyone. During the January 6th insurrection, if you will, they saw Milley, and they saw what Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Milley did, and they learned from that. So they need a portion, at least, of the flag officers, the generals and admirals, and they're getting them very carefully. And they need a portion of the middle ranks, colonels, lieutenant colonels, and sergeants major, and they need a lot of the lower ranks. He is building those lower ranks as rapidly as he can, and he's mostly using Christian nationalism to do it. He holds prayer meetings in the Pentagon. He makes sure he gets a list of those people who don't show up for the meetings. It's very efficient. It's not him doing it, it's his deputy doing it. And it's very efficient, and what he's doing is he's creating a circumstance where another coup, were it to be attempted, would not fail like it did before because they didn't have the military on their side. Milley refused to join them, wouldn't leave barracks, as it were. I'm worried about this group. We may start a war inside the military.
Go ahead and ask your question, please.
Yeah. Actually, I was thinking the same thing, and I heard you say he's not actually doing it, it's his deputies. My question is, none of those guys on top are actually dropping the bombs, flying the airplanes. They're not doing it. What are the people who have to do this stuff thinking? What are the guys and women who are in the military and having to follow these orders doing, thinking? I'm not military myself, but does that make sense?
You want to take that?
One thing I know that's happening, and I wish it would spread, the Vermont governor, who has F-35s in his air reserve component, flying in the war. He's trying to take his guard back from the federal government. Is he going to be successful? Alone, no. But if a number of state governors joined him in this, particularly powerful ones who have huge components of either air or army or other guard or reserve components, if they joined him in it, the power in this country constitutionally is in the states, not the federal government. Read the Constitution. All powers not enumerated here belong to the states or the people. That's the beauty of the Constitution. Well, we've let that go to hell. the federal government has usurped the state's power. And MAGA and the Tea Party before it and others were all about getting state power back, and they fouled their nest. They fouled it majorly. That was a good movement. Power belongs in the states, not in Washington.
Yeah, I mean, that the recognition of that is also scary, that the power belongs to the states, because we have a history. And when states assert themselves, then you have this possibility of separation. But what I would note and observe is they talk about divisions in our society, and there are many of them. But we have effectively a two-party system. And the reason that two-party system and the locale of the effectiveness of the two-party system is at the federal level. And that's why we're lobbied to vote, and that's why, because with our electoral system, two parties. So they're very close together in so many ways. In fact, they both love war, actually. If you check out your top leadership of both of these parties, they're very much enthusiastic about the military-industrial complex, the kickbacks, the bribery, the system without audits. They like that very much, both of them. So, but if you push down to states and local communities, we often see people that are centrist or third party or no party gaining the confidence of the people that vote for them and leading. And that's self-government, and that's Republican government, and that is constitutional in the sense that we can govern ourselves at the lowest level possible. The powers reserved, both the 9th and the 10th, are talking about the powers that aren't mentioned here, specifically, and any you can think of, belong to the states and the people. So, anyway, there's a chance.
We're almost to the 6 o'clock hour. It's been a lively discussion. I want to thank our panel members, and I want to thank those of you who were here and listened and asked questions. I wonder we could wrap this up by each of you just taking a few moments and express your final thoughts to this group of people. You want to start? Here.
Go ahead, if you want to
I'm going to be really short.
Okay.
That's why I want to.
Okay.
So I talk too much, but no, I may sound negative or pessimistic, and in many ways I am, but also I trust that our hearts are much more in common than what they are separated. And I think that we intellectually can understand a lot of things and we can debate them, but I think in our hearts we feel things that are right. We know what truth looks like. We know what our duties are to each other. And so I think that's where the hope is going to be. So I hope everybody take care of your heart.
Well, depending on the version of the story, and I don't think it's totally apocryphal, it's a wonderful story. When the Constitutional Convention convened for its last time and then closed the record, Ben Franklin supposedly walked outside the building and was accosted by a citizen who said, "What happened in there? What did you do?" And he looked at her and he said, "A republic, if you can keep it. We haven't been keeping it."
There is, to the question that was asked about the men and women who serve our country, there's a concern that I have and that they may have down the road. There is such a thing as an illegal order. During the closing days of World War II, when they did the Nuremberg trials, the United States advanced laws of war. We advanced concepts of crimes against humanity. We pretty much wrote the UN Charter. We did a lot of the things that, and then we prosecuted the Nazis for that. So we wrote the laws and then we prosecuted people for that. And the concept of an illegal order is that I cannot, no matter how superior, a four-star general cannot order a private to kill civilians, unarmed civilians. That would be an illegal order. We teach people what are illegal orders. A guy in a boat that could have been intercepted, and you don't even know what's on the boat, being blown up. would fit into that case of illegal orders. Blowing up apartment buildings, blowing up schools would fit into that case of illegal orders. So while we're here at this particular moment in time, those men and women who are serving, who are following orders, down the road, they may be in jeopardy. Down the road, with another administration or something, there may be questions asked of those leaders who decided that, yeah, it's okay to bomb a school with 150 little girls in it. That question, it won't end here, this thing, but we created that order. I mean, those laws, those Americans developed those laws. It's that concept of an illegal. And then during the Vietnam War, we reinforced it. You know, we actually educated people. You can't do certain things. You can't just. So we don't know all the fallout for this, but are there crimes being committed? Are some of the things that we see, should they be considered illegal orders? I think the answer to that is yes. I think some of the things that we're seeing done fit into that category, and I hate to see us as a country do that. And I guess the final thing that I would leave with you is, when you listen to the words of the Commander-in-Chief and you ask yourself, and my wife and I have been asking ourselves this question, is this who we are? Is this the way we treat people? Is this the way we go around the world? Do we tell leaders of other countries to kiss our ass? Do we? Yeah, it's just. I spent 20 years in the United States Army, and a good part of that decade in combat units, willing to do anything this country told me to. But I used to wake up in the morning and tell my daughters, it's another great day to be an American. I don't do that anymore.
This has clearly been a heavy conversation. I want to thank you all for coming out. From my perspective, I will hopefully be a little bit more optimistic and say I honestly believe that this is a winning message. That to share with our fellow Americans that a policy of restraint is actually the best policy moving forward. That's a winning message. A message saying that war has negative long-term consequences. That's a message that most Americans can get behind. Most Americans, I believe, can embrace the message that defense budgets and rising militarization of American foreign policy are unhealthy to a democracy. Those are positive, winning messages for us. And so I think the challenge then is to not be seduced by these politics of division and instead find ways locally and then regionally and hopefully nationally where we can inspire our fellow Americans to embrace this winning message, because this is the message I think that is going to get us out of the doldrums we're in right now. And the challenge is for us to not engage in those divisive politics, but to be inspirational. And I think what we've seen here today, just by you participating, is that that's possible. So thank you.
Gregory has ended us on a positive note, and thank you for doing that. I think we needed to hear some positivity. General, do you have a word before we break up? Here we go.
First of all, I'd like to thank all of you for being here. And I wonder, how many of you were at the No Kings rally? Participate? Yeah, that's what I thought. It's great. It's great. Look, I appreciate you all being here. We're going to continue to work as hard as we can. What we talked about in terms of being a network of Truthtellers. I think it's important, and I'd like to tell you that, you asked where can you go to get good information, to get true information. Go to the Eisenhower Media Network website. And we have a Substack there that give you a lot of our writings and a lot of things we're doing, and we'll try to do more of it, but I think it's a good place to start, and we will continue to work at it. So I'd like to thank the Governor Strickland and our panelists. Ask you to give them a hand. Okay. All right, and thank you for being here, and drive carefully getting home.